here with Sushma Nallapeta, and we're going to do a little fireside chat on how to react to and overcome failures, or AKA failure as a launch pad, AKA how to propel from failures, any which way. So I'm going to briefly intro you, Sue, so that you have that, and then feel free to add additional color if you'd like. So Sue started her career journey and moved as a software engineer and moved to a late stage startup as an engineering manager. That company went through bankruptcy, which propelled her management and leadership career. And then she went on to manage managers and directors and had all the engineering across 2 different companies. And so with that, Sue, if you would like to add any additional color and or introduce yourself, feel free to share.
Awesome. Thank you, David. Hey, everyone. I'm super excited to be here. So this is what you know about me externally, what David said, and what you don't know about me is that I didn't get here without my fair share of failures, whether it is micromanaging a team or expecting them to do the job the same way I do, or to not addressing underperformers in time or soon enough, or failing to manage upwards and sideways as needed and when needed, or making decisions based on emotions rather than facts, or failing to speak up what I wanted out of my career multiple times in my career. So as Albert Einstein said, a person who never made a mistake, never tried anything new. Through every one of these failures, I had to introspect, endure, and learn. So I want to share some of those experiences with you all today.
I'm excited to hear about them. This whole thing we like to forget our failures, but then when we think back on them, we remember how they really are. They do make us who we are. I reflect for myself on in the early days of just trying to get a first job. I applied as a software engineer at Google and I got rejected. Mm-hmm. And in the rejection feedback, they were like, but maybe, some people said that maybe you could be a product manager. And I was like, what's that? And then 7 interviews later, I had got a product management role at Google and kind of shaped a lot of my career. So I say that just to say I empathize with this idea of a failure as a launch pad, and I'm very excited to learn about the failures you've experienced and how they've launched you. And so in that the first question in that regard, I'd love to ask, what was a failure that propelled your career or changed it for the better?
Yeah, when I reflect back, I think there are 2 that come to my mind. One is a personal one, and one is an organizational failure. So my first failure in my career was actually not articulating or establishing myself as a strong technical leader. This happened when I was an individual contributor. Though I had architected a few systems by myself, gotten a lot of accolades from clients that I was working with, I had a lot of new ideas that could propel the organization. I just could not articulate the impact of my work in the organization or what I could bring to the table well enough. I learned that having a technical depth is not enough, but also having a breadth of knowledge and working with people and creating that alignment, bringing them along the journey and walking them through your ideas is like what makes you a great and strong leader. So that lesson then propelled me to actually pursue a career in management. And then when I became a manager for the first time in my career, I went through a bankruptcy situation that you just touched upon. And it was not easy because I had to deal with one, just going through the bankruptcy and dealing with all the emotions that come through that, but also balancing transparency with my direct reports versus motivating them. And asking them to stay the course, not knowing that this company is actually going to come out of this, or is it just going to wind down? And that was a very hard thing to do as a first-time manager. So a lot of lessons learned from my leaders back then, who actually did an amazing thing. They actually said, we don't know what's going to happen, but let's do the best thing we could possibly do. We actually launched a new product during a bankruptcy phase, worked on it ground up, launched it. It was a huge customer success. We got acquired, the company shut down, but a lot of lessons learned just going through that journey.
I can't even imagine what it would be like to be in that kind of situation. It's like the degree of uncertainty, it seems massive. So how did you cope yourself and manage the team to navigate through that? I mean, if you have any tips or tricks, I'm kind of
Yeah,
curious.
I think, and given this was like my first time as a manager, I didn't even know how to have one-on-ones with my team. I had a general idea, but I would actually literally follow what my managers would do with me and then kind of translate. But like just going through this bankruptcy situation, I was an immigrant, I was on a visa, I was like, okay, I myself will probably lose a job. And we learned about bankruptcy of our parent company that was Eastman Kodak like in December. And then we didn't know what would happen like from December through April. Like that was the period of uncertainty. I was like, should I go find a job or like, should I stick through it? I actually prefer not to run away from problems and I want to like just go through them. So I actually stuck around. And then that's when our leadership came together. I'd never seen leadership do something like that, where they're like, let's turn the situation around. We can't control the destiny, but at least what we can control is what we do about it. So when we started launching the new product, everybody from engineering to product to operations to even people in the production line who are making photo products like photo magnets and stuff were super busy, super excited. And that kept the whole company together. And then finally, like, there was no way to keep that company up and running.
I'm reminded myself of like having to shut down an office and like let go of like 8 people. So I can only imagine like an entire bankruptcy like that. It's the magnitude is insane. So how do you handle, failures just in general? Are all failures equal? When you fail as an individual contributor versus a manager, or, versus when you're in a leadership role, like I'm curious to hear like what, how you handle those different types of failures, and what things are the same and what things have been different.
Yeah, so they are equal to some extent. They are not to another extent. They are equal in the sense that they all hurt you the same when you make them. It takes a long time for you to overcome that situation. Just dealing with the fact that, oh, I made this mistake and then this is the impact it had. But the consequences of these failures at each and every level almost like is very, very different. The decisions at every step like almost has a boundary and a radius of impact. So as an IC, your impact is much lower. You have a very small radius, but as you become a manager or a leader, it can be large. And sometimes it's not just about impacting a project or a team. It's damaging relationships. It is impacting the business, and maybe like it's a pivotal point in like some of the decisions that you make, how a business can either grow or like become stagnant. So dealing with some of those, it's very, very key. So one of the key things that I have learned in my journey is like, there are 3 reasons people fail or give up on something. Number 1 is boredom. Like people just get bored and like, they're like, oh, this is not worth pursuing anymore. I just want to give up. Many people quit because they're like bored. Second one is they find it really hard to endure. And it's like, and they just don't have that perseverance to just go through that failure. And lastly, this is the biggest one. It reminded me when you mentioned Google, like the fear of failure makes them not even want to attempt it. Like for me back then, I had a fear of failing an interview, which would be like, oh, I'm not even going to try applying for companies like this. But failure is kind of like a ladder. As a society, we associate failure with being at the bottom, but actually, if you think about the ladder's rungs, like each rung is like a step that you learn and climb back up. So I use that framework to help me react to situations differently.
I love that. It ties into, I have a framework for happiness that's also like 3-pronged, which is pleasure, meaning and purpose, and then like a good mood or flow. And like each of those actually tie into each of your failure, I don't know, it's a failure triangle. Yeah, there you go. Failure triangle. I absolutely love that. I'd love to plant the seed for audience Q&A. So any folks that have any questions, feel free to go into the Q&A tab on the side and write your questions. Feel free to upvote questions if you don't have any yourself, and I'll move on to the audience Q&A soon. So we've heard about a pretty extravagant failure, if you will, that you made the best of. We've heard about this kind of 3-pronged kind of why does failure, the failure triangle or whatever you call it.
Mm-hmm.
So what were some tools or mental models or techniques that you use to overcome the failures you've encountered?
Yeah, I think the number one that always comes to mind is don't have an unrealistic expectation about yourself, which is what I tell all my leaders. Don't hold out for perfection and not try enough. Like failure is inevitable, it is bound to happen. And failures, like when they do happen, you have to figure out what categorization of failure that is and then figure out how to react to it. Like usually like failures fall into these three broad categories. One are like unavoidable failures that happen because the system is super complex. Again, these are like systemic issues in your organization. It's bound to happen. And no matter how much you plan for it, like all the risk mitigation that you put in place, it'll happen because you just don't know enough. There's a new team that is in place, like there's the code base is like 10 years old, things like that. But then there are preventable failures. Like these are those that you kind of know you might actually end up failing, but you go ahead and do it anyway and not think through enough, which is something that like I really try and avoid. And then the third kind of failures is just like intelligent failures, as one of the Duke University professors put it. Like he says, like this is key to actually discover something new. Like usually you find these intelligent failures lead often to a new discovery, maybe discovery of new drugs or new innovation and stuff. So those kind of failures you want to constantly make, knowing that it will just propel you to go to the next level. So I use this kind of a mental model to deal with failures. Like one, at least try and avoid preventable failures if you can. And then when they do happen, own up to them without bias. Don't be a victim, but also don't be a hero. Owning up to failures goes a long way. Just saying that, yes, I own it, I'm going to fix it, you'll show up better as a leader. And then also give advice to your future failure self. We are also good at giving advice to other people, but not to yourself, like when your things are going bad for you. So you kind of always, you have to try to reset yourself, put yourself in that position and say, okay, what advice would I give my failure self to overcome any failure? And use it as a tool almost to avoid making the same mistake again.
I appreciate the separation of these different types of failure, because I think a lot of Silicon Valley, I think, probably does welcome failure, and a lot of tech kind of welcomes failure culturally versus a lot of industries where it doesn't. But it's true that I think there probably are a lot of folks that kind of welcome all failures with the same broad brushstroke. And I appreciate your separating out, that like if there is an avoidable failure, which your lack of time or research or preparation causes that failure, that it probably shouldn't be treated or handled in the same way as one of these intelligent failures. Right.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of the intelligent failures, like of a couple of startups that went on to do great things, right? Like Bourbon, which failed and then became Instagram, right? Or I know the story of Slack that kind of started as a completely different company and then had this tool that kind of developed and became Slack, So it's nice to be reminded of that. Though one of the pharma, this is like super common, right? Like the drug to reduce or to lower your risk of prostate cancer, turned out like it grew hair and then switched to become Propecia, hair growth, which actually might increase your risk of prostate cancer, ironically, it's just crazy. But it's cool to kind of hear about that distinction between the types of failure. So as a VP or head of engineering, I'm curious, how do you set your team up for both success and failure? It's great that you have, I imagine, create a culture that's very welcoming of failure, given that you see the value in it. But how do you also enable your team to be successful as well?
Yeah, I think honestly, like we recently did a 360 feedback for all of our exec team. And for me, one of the biggest thing that showed up that I need to work on is I empower people too much. And then so I need to cut back a little bit on it. But I think as I think about what I would do is one, I think it's very important for managers and my engineers, leaders in general, to provide autonomy and have that autonomy to operate, but provide some level of boundary to the failure so that you kind of impact the blast radius, but also you provide enough cushion so that they can learn, like pretty much taking off the training wheels very soon so that people actually can experiment and fail, but not negatively impact the organization. And also you have to provide more exposure to problems and situations. The more decisions you make, the better you get at recognizing which are bad and which are good. So just having that ability to make those decisions is key, especially when you're much early in your career. The other last thing I would say is like resetting yourself is very important. Like you as a leader, the same decision that you made 1 to 2 years ago might no longer be relevant because your organization has changed and scaled. I'll give an example. At Apartment List, 2 years ago, my engineering team was at like 25. Now we've doubled the team, and I've put certain processes, team structure, career ladder in place. I absolutely know I need to redo all of that now because a lot of things have changed. It's going to change some more when we double again in the next year or so. So how do you reset yourself? And knowing that, like, don't hold on to that perfection, thinking that, oh, I put out the best process, I worked hard. Just think that whatever you put in, it's relevant for that stage of the company. The stage has changed, so you need to change and evolve along with it. Otherwise, you'll end up not adapting and remaining stagnant. One last thing that I'll say is, as a leader, like one of the most important thing is like self-discovery process, knowing your strength and then building your strength. And then the second thing is lots and lots of development. Once you know your strength, you need to spend a lot of time developing that strength. You never stop learning and honing on your skills. And then lastly, it's a lifetime of deepening. Just because you know your strength, you've developed them, it never stops you. Like you continue to succeed only if you go deeper in multiple areas and continue to grow your strengths and use your strengths to overshadow your weaknesses.
It's a really good call out. I know there are a lot of people that kind of think of like covering the broad, like, you know, here are my strengths and here are my areas of improvement, and spend your time focusing on improving on those areas where you're weak so you can kind of have broad coverage. And it sounds like what you're saying is focus on your strengths, and maybe you don't need to be good at everything. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to switch to audience Q&A because we have a bunch of questions here. So again, folks, feel free to keep asking questions and upvote other folks' questions. So this first question is from Sam. You mentioned failing to manage up or sideways. Can you give an example of a common failure in this area and any ways to avoid or overcome that failure?
Yeah, I think many. I think one of the biggest is us always like figuring out how much of a communication that you need to like kind of modulate with various audiences. And I think especially with upwards communication, it's always, we optimize for less, although we know we have to optimize for more. Like as it gets higher and higher, like for example, my communication with my CEO or like as an exec team, the amount of communication you need to have is almost like anytime there is a problem, you kind of immediately have to communicate that, hey, here's the problem, here's what I'm doing to fix it. But as it gets lower and lower, like at Inge manager level or at a director level, people often forget to over communicate on things because they're like, oh, my boss is busy, there is no need, I'm going to fix this, which is great. Like you have the ability to go fix problems, but you also need to over communicate. So I have faced many situations where I've not over communicated it, or I've not told my manager that, hey, this is what I'm dealing with right now. This is an FYI, you need to know about it. But if I had, they would have provided some context or jumped in and tried to help, or even like just been there to provide alternative perspectives that might have prevented a lot of other failures that could have been avoided. So I would say managing up and sideways, always over communicate when in doubt.
I love that. And I remember days when I've heard people say, I'm sure you've heard people say this, right? Like, oh, well, why didn't you tell me about this thing? Well, I sent the email, or like, did you see my Slack? Or, like that was in the presentation I did a week ago or something, right? But it's like, no, the point is like, over communicating itself is like what you got to do, right? And that communicating something once, like we're all human, right? It's like accounting for people's own busyness, and memory. right?
Yeah, and then also knowing that different people have different styles of receiving communication. Some people are like they want presentations. They're like what we call lookers. Like they'll understand information better when it's like more visual. And some people understand information when it's more document style. And some people will just want you to get on a call for 5 minutes and explain what's going on. So just understanding your audience and then reacting differently to different audience also helps quite a bit.
I love that. And taking ownership that, if somebody didn't hear something, even if you mention it once, that maybe you got to over communicate it and that is your responsibility. I think it's a great call out. So this question from Faith is, how can we create a culture of celebration around failure and how to develop from it?
Yeah, I think a lot of times we sort of associate like accountability with punishment. But honestly, like accountability is like not to punish somebody. So that's why I love like when we do retrospectives, like to do blameless retrospectives. Always, it's not about one person and what did they do wrong. It's often about, as a team, like what were some challenges that the team faced? What could have been avoided? What are some systemic issues that might have contributed to it? If we were to redo this, what would we do differently? And I think that is key to bring the team together, especially when during a situation of failure, because you have to celebrate failures. As I said, like preventable, unavoidable failures and like intelligent failures, you have to categorize them. Preventable failures, sometimes you do end up making them, then those become people problems that you need to probably address on an individual basis. But for the other two, it's pretty much like a cause for celebration and understanding, like, great, we failed, but what did we actually learn? So let's actually use that learning to do the next best thing. Like one of my CEO loves to say this, but like we always try to optimize for like the middle path. Like when there is a huge success, like celebrations, like people are doing an excellent job, we forget to recognize that and like, not really celebrate. And then there are times when people really mess up, like there's the huge failures, projects fail. Even in those situations, we don't actually spend a lot of time discussing what happened and how to prevent it. We kind of tend to always stay in the middle. So we need to actually like expand that and then have a focus across both wins as well as failures.
Well, I appreciate the celebration concept, but I also appreciate that you're calling out that some of the preventable failures, where somebody maybe either isn't thorough in their job or research, or whether, there's a personal problem that, you don't necessarily have to, yay, you messed up. Like there's a place for some of the celebration, but that place, what I'm hearing is it's more on the learning side, celebrate the learning.
And I think this is what companies call psychological safety. Like you need to provide that psychological safety to know that when failures happen, it's not always like a blame, but you're actually going to get together and learn from each other. And once you create that psychological safety, it leads to innovation, because before you kind of cross that barrier to innovate, like you have to go through multiple failures, and that's a given. So any companies that don't create that psychological safety are not doing something right.
Yeah, I've definitely seen this manifest like at the engineering level when folks write code that has silent failures. Like instead of failing loudly, the code itself, they're catching exceptions and then logging something somewhere so that it doesn't get surfaced. And then meanwhile, things are like breaking. And when you have a culture where failure isn't encouraged, that's what happens. And you end up discovering way down the road that something has been catching all these exceptions. But failing loudly, these are places where it's like, throw the exception, send the alert email, like have the pagers go off endlessly until the thing is fixed. And when people feel free to do that and free to write that in their own code, that, like my code can break and it is okay, that turns out that people surface problems more quickly and we end up fixing them more quickly. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
Awesome. So this next question from Dave is, what steps do you, and obviously this won't work for everyone, take to not dwell on failures and hamper your own forward progress? I'm guessing if you're like probably a lot of people in the audience, maybe you're a high anxiety person or you're somebody that dwells, it's like, how do you move on?
I actually dwell a lot on my failures, and that's okay, because I think you need to process it and like let it digest and understand what you did and what went wrong, what didn't, what could you have done differently. And it's okay to actually spend some time really like reflecting on that failure, and really understanding your positions. Just as you're dwelling through it, just try not to justify yourself like too much. Like sometimes we tend to do that, like when we fail and then we try to counter saying like, there was no other way. Like there was nothing else I could have done. But instead of like justifying that failure, like just note down, what else could I have tried? What other path I could have taken? And then because you're just reflecting with yourself, like it's you're doing it in full sort of like privacy, without like within a shield like that you don't have to reveal to anybody else. So here you can pretty much be hard on yourself and say, okay, like I could have done this, or this could have been different, or this person could have been like said things differently. And then once you actually recognize all of this, go back and have a conversation with that person or with the team as a failure has happened, and talk through it, and try to talk about your emotions, about how you're feeling, because a lot of times people connect better when it's at the emotional level than it is at the factual level. The fact is that things got messed up, but at the emotional level, just saying that, hey, you know what, I pretty much I felt bad too about this failure. This was not how I show up. This is very different for me, and it's been hard for me to process this. And like talk through that with some of your peers, and then you will see how much people will lean in as well. Because then it no longer becomes about you, it becomes about how can we all help you so that this doesn't happen again. So you'll end up building a lot of support from your own peer group as you start to be a little bit more vulnerable.
I absolutely love you surfacing the emotional side, because, as engineers, like we all think that, we can rationalize our way through things, but like these failures, sometimes they hurt, we take them personally. And sometimes no matter how rational we are, we can't actually like process it without being able to express the emotion, to our managers or our direct reports, or expressing them to us. Like, I think that's very wise.
Because people will not argue when you say, I felt angry, I felt sad, I felt whatever you felt, because those are your feelings. So instead of you justifying saying like, oh, this person should have said this, or this person should have said this, if you just rely on your feelings and talk about it, now you're creating a baseline that other person can connect you with. And then you start going one level up and talk about how could you have changed the situation.
I love it. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. So this one from Jordan, regarding people giving up when they find it hard to endure. Any thoughts on helping someone understand when it makes sense to endure versus taking the loss and moving on?
Yeah, I think that's a very important one. I like the way I think about it is the more you do it, the better you get at it. Like initially it's hard to really like figure out in which one to endure and which one to take the loss and move on. But sometimes it's like you also have to ask yourself, are you doing this because like you're losing patience, or is it like a fear that the outcome is going to just be bad? And I think it goes back to the mental model of what is the cause of this failure? Is it boredom? Is it like fear of failure? Or is it just like you're no longer able to endure because you've reached a limit in terms of your brain capacity to just handle this? Once you recognize that, then it's figuring out if you have allies, whether it's within your company or whether it's outside, that you can talk through about the situation and explore options to say, hey, I can give up. That's the easiest path. But like, if I were to not give up, what else would I do? And how would I change? And a lot of times when we think about like failures, we almost say like, okay, we need to find a perfect solution, but it might not always be perfect. Like you have to figure out, can I really radically shift my thinking and do something completely different? Like maybe I'm thinking about it all wrong. I need to reset and arrive at this problem a little differently. That's when you kind of realize like, okay, maybe there is a path. Because when you're boxed in, you kind of figure, you don't know how many paths there are, how many windows there are open, but sometimes you just need to get out of that box. And you could do that with some allies, You could do it like with some friends, even, or the community, like Plato.
It's a great segue. That's wonderful. And it reminds me that, sometimes we think that there's like a right way to do life or to handle a situation or whatever. And it's ultimately there's just actions and consequences, whether like we don't have to make everything good or bad, etc. So I appreciate your willingness to share your stories and your wisdom about failure and how it's propelled you through life.
Yeah.
So yeah. So with that, we are at time. So I want to thank you so much, Sue, for again your wisdom, your vulnerability, and your expression of how failure has propelled you. And it's always lovely to see you. I'm looking forward to see you in person once we're all out of this pandemic. Thank you for being a wonderful mentor in the Plato community. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.